see in today's session how the clients which has got the Oracle client software installed communicates to the server. Now this particular thing indicates the database which has a name, say for example national. In our case the setup is somewhat like this one. We have a DB server which is running on to Oracle 2. The IP address is 192.168.0.2 and the Oracle home where the Listener.ora file exists. So the complete path has been given as Oracle home network admin Listener.ora. Depending on whatever configuration settings you put into Listener.ora, accordingly we will start the listener. Then we will see how dynamic service registration happens and so on. The client PC, which is this portion of the diagram, is the Oracle 5 machine. Now I assume that there's a Oracle client software installed and the clients communicate with the server by using some names resolution method. I assume that the names resolution method is local names, and local names require you to configure tnsnames.ora on the client side. This is how you this particular client machine will come to know the address of the server part, counterpart, where the listener runs. So the job of the listener is to accept an incoming connection request. So whenever going ahead your client makes a connection request from here to here, so here at this particular part you have that listener configured. So client forwards a connection request using the tnsnames.ora. We'll see how to configure that, and then on the other side you have a listener running that we'll see how to configure as well using the GUI tool netmgr. And then once you have a listener configured, we will see how dynamic service registration happens, how to do static registration and so on, and we will examine intermediate status on the listener. So assuming that we have the necessary environment variables set, I am querying some of them. So let me first show you what is our host name. So we are on to the DB server, and then the Oracle home is set to this particular path, and my database seed is national. The database is up and running as of now. So I see that the database is up and running. So let me check if I have a listener running here. So as of now there's no listener. So we want to configure a listener on the server side so that going ahead my client machine can communicate directly to the server. The initial connection handoff has to happen via the listener process. So far we don't see any listener process configured on this box. To configure a listener, if it's a default listener, there is no configuration required. So I am taking you to the Oracle home network admin directory. There is no listener.ora as of now. Even when the file is not there, you can still start a default listener simply by saying lsnrctl start. So it checks whether there's a file called as listener.ora in the Oracle home network admin, and accordingly will start the listener. But we know that there's no listener.ora there, so it will start the default listener. Now the default listener qualifies onto certain criteria. Number one, the protocol should be TCP and the port should be 1521, and in our case the listener is running on the same machine where the database is hosted. So such a listener is called as the default listener. Now there are various advantages when you use a default listener. Number one, whenever you start any database, on that given server, the pmon process will do the dynamic service registration. With the default listener running on the same host. But the catch is the listener should be a default listener, meaning the protocol should be TCP and that the port should be 1521. So if you have such listener running on that box, then pmon can automatically do a dynamic service registration with the given listener. Let's see how that dynamic service registration works. Now that I have started the listener, let's see whether or not I can see that listener as a running process. The listener's process is tns-ls-nr, and I see that there's a listener running. The name of the listener is listener. You can also find out on the basis of that PID which port that particular listener is using. I am using lsof command -i TCP :1521 is the port where typically that listener starts. I need to do that as root, and then it gives me the PID of that process, which is in a listen mode. If you see, the name of the executable is tns-ls-nr. This is the PID of that process which is running as the user oracle on this box, is using TCP, and it is currently in a listening state on port number 1521, and this is nothing but our listener process, the one that we started. Now once the listener is up and running, you can verify the status by saying lsnr-ctl status. I could have optionally provided the name of the listener, but this is not mandatory if the listener is a default listener. If you change the name of the listener to something else, then you must put in the name. But in the default case, the name of the listener is listener. So when I check the status, you can see that the name of the listener is listener. It has been started on so and so date and time. The uptime of the listener has been 3 minutes and 11 seconds so far. This is very important. The security level in 10G is set to on local OS authentication. Means only a Unix user connected to this machine as user oracle can bring down that listener. Nobody else can bring down that listener. So that's why listeners in 10G does not require any password as such. If you see going ahead, there's a listener log file. This log file describes who is connecting to this listener over a network. We will not see any movement as of now for this particular listener because no one else is connecting, but I could see there has been a service update. So periodically pmon updates the listener about that service. So see here, immediately we got an update from the pmon process periodically goes and updates with the listener. That's how my listener is aware that there's a database with the name national, which is having the instance name as national, and currently the state of that instance shows as ready. Means if a client comes with a request, connection request to this listener saying I want to connect to the national database, my listener is already aware that there's an instance with the name national and currently it's ready to accept connection. Let me bring down this database and then query the status of that listener. So I am logging on to my national database. I am saying select name from $v database just to confirm that I am connected to the correct database, and then I bring down the database. So pmon periodically also goes and updates the current load on the instance to the listener. So at any given point in time, your listener is aware about the current workload that an instance is handling. Then I again say lsnr-ctl status. There's no more national database listed here. Clear? Now I go and log in, but this time instead of saying a full startup, we'll do a step-by-step startup. I say startup no mount. So my listener is my instance is started. Pmon must have started as the first process. We can verify it, which was the first one. Then I go to the background dump destination. Looking for the file alert.log. I open this file and jump towards the end. Here I get to see which was the first process to start. The first mandatory background process that starts up is pmon. Now pmon is default coded to register the given instance with the default listener running on that same host. So let's see whether or not pmon has updated the status with the listener. My listener has come to know that there's a database or a database instance with the name national, but since my instance is in a no mounted state, people cannot connect it because users can only connect to a database which is in an open state. That's why the status is showing as blocked. I take it one level up by saying alter database mount, and then we'll requery. In a mount status also, people cannot connect to the database instance over a network, obviously. Now when I check, although it is showing status as ready, but people cannot still, normal user cannot still connect. Normal user is like Scott and Tiger. But yes, if any network based request comes in, my listener can still accept connection request for the given database, although further things might change depending on what type of a connection has been requested. If it's a sysdba connection, my listener will accept it. But if it's a normal DB user account like Scott, then it will not be accepted because the database is not open as of now. Then I take it further by saying alter database open, and now onwards normal users can also connect in. Again we will query the status of the listener. So it says the national instance, the service is known and is in a ready state. Now people from the network can connect in through listener to my database. The next thing is, what if I stop the listener? Now I am stopping the listener. There is no Listener.ora required for the default configuration. Now if I say lsnr_ctl status, it errors out saying there is no such listener running on this machine. Then I can start it up by saying lsnr_ctl start, and then we'll immediately query the status. See, so far my listener doesn't know about any database which is running on this machine. So we'll wait for some time until it receives a service update from pmon process. Now how sooner or later that happens, we don't know. So pmon will periodically wake up and will do the service registration. From that point onwards, my listener will come to know that okay, there's one more instance running on this box and that is national. But how long it takes, nobody knows. So it's periodically that pmon would wake up at some point in time and will then do a status update. See here. So immediately I get, so pmon for one database has registered dynamically the database service BS CS RPT as well as the national data. Now if I check the listener status, now my listener knows about these two databases. There's a manual way of doing this as well. I am again bringing it down. I am again starting it up, and then immediately I say lsnr_ctl status. My listener doesn't know about any database. Then I log on to the database and then I do a forceful registration by saying alter system register. I come out of this one and then again I say lsnr_ctl status. So the listener knows that there's a database called as national. So this was a manual way of registering by saying alter system register. Otherwise, if you have patience, then wait for pmon to wake up periodically and do the service registration. If you do not have the patience to wait, then you can manually forcefully do that using a command by saying alter system register. Otherwise, anyways, next cycle when the pmon wakes up, it will do a dynamic service registration with the default listener that's running on that box. So far my listener still doesn't knows about the other database running because we never did that. Now it has in the meanwhile got that update that there's another database and it is this, and both the databases are being shown as ready, means network users can now connect to this particular database. Next we will see how to configure Listener.ora. So I go to Oracle Home, Network, Admin, and then I check for the file Listener.ora. So far I do not have any file. Now the only recommended or supported way of you creating a Listener.ora is to either use netmgr or netca utility. Now both of them are GUI utilities, so I cannot run them through putty. I would need a VNC session from where I can launch them. So I am starting a VNC session on my server on port 1. It's already running, it says. Yeah, it's already there. From my client machine, then I connect to this VNC session. Password seems to be incorrect. Once I am there in the VNC session, I can say netmgr or netca. Let's try doing it through netca. So if there's any listener running as of now, I will bring it down and then we'll configure it through the netca utility. To start a default listener, as I said earlier, you don't need even a Listener.ora. Once we have this GUI, it offers you what you want to do. I want to configure the listener. I move on to the next one. Here it says, do you want to add a listener, reconfigure it, delete it or rename it? I say add one. The default name of the listener is listener. I would suggest keeping it as same. Otherwise every command that you type, you will have to type the listener name. So if it's the same name as listener, then typing that name in LSNR, CTL, start, stop or status is optional. I have moved, by the way, last screen it prompted which protocol is to be supported. So I said default choice is TCP, and then which is the port that you want to run. The standard port number is by default 1521. If you want to create a non-default listener, you can select any other port. I would however select the default port for the discussion. Would you like to configure another listener? I say no, I don't want to. So I am back here where we stopped the earlier listener, which was without any configuration file, and then we'll see whether or not the listener that we have configured is up and running. So far I don't see any listener up and running, neither I see any file created so far. I am still waiting for it. So I see some error being dumped in the background. See here, there's some error and it says file error caused by something unexpected character or literal and so on. For whatever reason it's erroring out. Need to troubleshoot. I'm going to cancel this wizard. Probably our Oracle home might not be correct. Let's check. Is it the correct Oracle home that we have? Yes. Let's try it using netmgr. There seems to be some problem with the netca configuration. But anyways, let's see it through netmgr if we can configure successfully a listener. I go back to see whether there's any listener.ora configured. So far there's no listener.ora. Once we have this GUI netmgr, which stands for network manager, we can configure a listener from there as well. So here is that network net manager. I go to local and from here I go to listeners. So far there is no listener configured. So from here I go and then I say I want to create a listener. Default name is listener. Then it will ask me the listening location. Where is that listener listening? So I say from here add address. Then it's asking me, is it TCP IP Oracle and 1521? Yes, this is where we want to configure that listener. And then I save this configuration and then I come out. Now if I go to that location, now we should have Listener.ora. If you see what's there, it simply defines in a formatted way that the name of the listener is listener, address is equal to protocol equal to TCP, host on which that listener runs, and the port on which it is configured to listen. Once you have it, you can say lsnrctl start, and your listener is up and running. Now if for some reason if you want to change the port, you can always do that. So I am bringing down that listener, and then I will follow the recommended method of changing it through netmgr. You can always change it through a file. So I am going directly to Listener.ora, and then instead of going through that GUI, I am changing the port directly here. I have started that listener, I have configured it now for port 1522. Then I say lsnrctl start. If you see the endpoint listening summary, the listener is configured to run on port 1522. But now the problem is dynamic service registration will not happen now. Let's see. So I log into my database, and then I say alter system register. I come out, and then I say lsnrctl status. So my listener still doesn't knows about any such service. That is because pmon is hard coded to look for default listener only. Now this is not a default listener since port is not 1521. So that's why dynamic service registration is not possible. Now the solution is either change it to port 1521 so that pmon can then do a dynamic service registration, or do static registration. This is how my current Listener.ora looks like. I jump onto here, I go to my listener section. Here's my listener, which is currently running on port 1522. Now I want to provide statically the seed list section in the listener, which is currently not there. So from here, drop down list, I say database services. So far there is no database that is statically registered. So I say add a database, and then it asks me what is the name of the database. I say it's national. Which Oracle home it runs it from. So the Oracle home is U002 APP Oracle product 1020, and the name of the database as well, seed, is national. Now when I save this one, changes are made to your Listener.ora. I will keep this one open, and then we run cat on Listener.ora one more time. But now you see a different section has been added, and that is the seed list section. So I have hard coded in my listeners configuration file Listener.ora that on the same host there's a database called as national. So going ahead, see what is the difference. So far my listener doesn't know. I have changed the configuration when my listener was up and running. So I must shut it down and start up so that it reads the modified configuration, or I must say lsnrctl reload. So it reloads the entire configuration. We'll see the status command afterwards. So I revised the configuration without shutting down and restarting the listener by simply saying lsnrctl reload. Now my listener is aware that there's one database with the name national, but if you look into it, says status is unknown, because my listener doesn't know exactly whether the given database is up or not. So whenever you see status as unknown, it indicates that you are doing a static registration. In a dynamic registration, the status would either be blocked if the database is in a no mount state, or the status would be ready if the database instance is ready to accept network based connection requests. So pretty much this one on to the listener configuration. Now when you say LSNR-CTL, it takes you to the LSNR-CTL prompt where you have a variety of commands which you can try. So I can say status, I can assign password by saying set or change command, but pretty much things can also be done from here. So I went to the netmgr utility and then I have general parameters. So I go from here saying logging and tracing. So where the log file is generated, by default this is the log file. If you want to enable tracing, by default tracing is disabled. If you want, you can enable tracing and then you can select the degree of information that is dumped into the trace file. User is the lowest level, so very little information would be available in the trace file. But if you select administrator or support, that means Oracle will dump everything into the trace file every time there happens a network communication with the listener. We don't want to enable tracing because tracing adds load on the listener. Then there's something called as authentication. Our listener does not have a password. As I said, the default security model in 10G says security is on and local OS authentication. Means who can shut down a listener? Only a person who is logged on to the same server can bring it down. In 9i, the default security model was off, so listener's password was as good as mandatory. Now, although we didn't assign one, but let's try assigning it. So I am saying Listener.ora. This is how it looks now, and then we will assign a password to the listener saying requires password. I am giving in a password. Once done, I will save this config and now see the difference in the Listener.ora. By the way, my password was something else, but an encrypted value has been put into the Listener.ora. Now even when there is a password, that doesn't mean that it's going to prompt me for a password while stopping or starting. So I am saying LSNR-CTL stop. It should not allow me to stop until I provide a password. But in 10G, the default behavior itself has changed. So any user who is logged in locally onto that machine can bring down that listener irrespective of the password. So that's why assigning a password to a listener doesn't make any sense starting from 10G and onwards. So it never prompted me for the password. So the moment I started the listener, due to the static registration, my listener knows that there's a database with the name national running on this machine, but currently it is not sure whether it is up or not. So I say do not assign the listener password because it doesn't make any sense, and I save the configuration. I come out. I will start and stop the listener one more time. So this is how your listener is configured. On the other side, on the client's machine, which is this part, you have that Oracle client software installed. Now once you have Oracle client software installed, you need here a TNS names.ora. Now in our case, the client PC is Oracle 5 with the IP address 192.168.0.5, and in the client's machine we will create TNS names.ora, and that's how my client on the other machine will come to know where to get connected. So I am then logged on to Oracle 5, will check where my Oracle home is, then I go to Oracle home network admin directory, and if there's an existing TNS names.ora, I am going to delete it. Now we will configure a fresh one. Now as with the listener, configuring TNS names.ora is done using netmgr utility. So I will invoke then a VNC session on 192.168.0.5, and then we will invoke netmgr to create TNS names.ora on the client side. Now that I have deleted this file, we no longer have any TNS names.ora here. So let's configure one. So to configure one, I must invoke netmgr, which requires a GUI. So I will start a VNC session. I go to that particular box, again VNC authentication, and once I am there, I am saying netmgr. That netmgr would help me configure net service name. So I jump on to local, then I jump to service naming. So far there is no service defined. I click on here, and then it says, okay, tell me where you want to connect. So net service name, so I call it as remote DB. It could be any name as you wish. Then it says using what protocol you want to connect, TCP. This protocol must be compliant with your listener's protocol. Then it says where I want to connect. I want to connect to the host 192.168.0.2, which also happens to be our DB host where the listener is running. And then I said, where is my listener running? Our listener is running on the other side on port 1522. Then it says, what is the name of the database to which you want to connect? We want to connect to the database with the name national. Once done, we have an option to test the service from here. It says the connection test was successful. It tried using Scott Tiger. So this indicates that the net service was created, and this is how it looks like once it's configured. I save this configuration. The configuration on the client machine is saved in the file tnsnames.ora. Now here you have the tnsnames.ora. See the formatting aspect. Remote DB, where to connect, the host where the listener runs, the port where the listener on the other side is listening, and the protocol, and request a connection to the database with the name national. Now once my TNS entry is defined, then my client can say connect me to Scott/Tiger@remote DB. So if the listener is ready on the other side, it will accept the connection request. Now I go to the listener. So far if you see here, there's hardly anything. Now I check listener services by saying lsnr/ctl services, and now you could see so far through this listener there are 2 established connections. We'll try one more time from the client machine. So here I am on to my client machine. I exit from here. I check the listener services one more time. So far there are 2 established connections. I try one more time. Then I come back. Once I am connected, we'll clear this one. Establish 3. So every net connection that is established, listener keeps a track of it. We'll see the listener status, and we'll do a tel-f of this log file. So I am doing a tel-f of my listener's log file. I am putting a Lakshman Rekha to find out what's happening thereafter, and then I come out from my client session. Then again I try to connect, and we should see client's data going through the listener.log. The moment my client connects, there's a log file entry being added. So who is connecting? So person wants to connect to national database. From where he is trying to connect? Somebody is trying to connect using SQL Star Plus tool from the host Oracle 5, and the connection is said to be have established. Clear? So this is how listener keeps track about the connections that are made. Now if you see lsnr/ctl status, this log file keeps on growing omnipotently, meaning there is no end to it, how big that file can grow. As of now I can see it's a quite smaller file, but as and when clients are connecting in under heavy load, this file will keep on growing. So periodically you must purge this file. You must delete it. There's no harm deleting it any time as long as you don't want to preserve the contents. So I have deleted it. So this is how my clients using the net service name remote DB can get connected to the server on the other side. So the clients determine what is the names resolution method. Now I again go to find out what is my names resolution method. I go to profile and then I can see that the names resolution order is TNS names, Easy Connect and host name. So when my client says this one, it needs to identify what this @remote DB is. Then it checks what is the default naming methods. So the naming methods are check first TNS names, then check Easy Connect, then check host naming, and then try to expand what is remote DB. Since the first method is TNS names, my client goes and checks in TNS names.ora. Can it see something called as remote DB? And then accordingly it will establish a connection. Now see, we'll do some jumbling here. I remove this method. And then I say save network configuration. These changes are saved in SQL net.ora on the client side. So see here, there is no longer T names as the resolution method. Now let's see what happens. My client now says connect to Scott/Tiger at remote DB. My client cannot resolve what that remote DB is. Although I have a TNS names.ora on the same machine, but my client doesn't feels that is one of the preferred way of connecting. So it doesn't go and checks my TNS names. I add back this method again, but as the third one. Priority wise it's the third method. Then I go and see what is the impact of it on my SQL net.ora. TNS names is there, but it's after Easy Connect, host naming and TNS names. Now I try to connect in, it will work, but time wise it will spend more time to find out what remote DB is. So first it will check Easy Connect way, it cannot expand what @remote_DB means. Then it will check host naming, it cannot expand what that means, and then it will go to TNS names, and finally it finds it in the TNS names.ora what that remote DB is. But it's still quick. But it has gone through all those three methods. Again I go here and we'll then see what is the Easy Connect way of connecting. My client can connect without anything simply by saying Scott/Tiger, and then I can specify that Easy Connect string. That Easy Connect string identifies which host, which port and which service you want to connect to. Exactly these details are what we have provided in the remote DB. So it doesn't identify it. There probably could have been some syntax error. Sorry, the port number I believe is different. It should have been 1522. Still I believe there is a slash issue. This slash should be this way and this is out. So clients can still connect even if they don't have the TNS names, provided in their file they must have selected Easy Connect option. So in my profile I have Easy Connect. Easy Connect means no configuration is required. Clients can directly connect in simply by saying SQL plus and username /password @hostname : port number / the name of the database. Similar way, if I would have had this same user in the other database which is on this host, we'll try to connect to this database. It doesn't work because my listener is not aware about any such service. So my listener has rejected it, saying TNS listener does not currently know of service requested in the connect descriptor. The service that you have requested is this one, and your listener is not aware about this service. Let's make that listener aware. In case of dynamic service registration, this will never be the case. Listener will be always aware. But now we are using a static registration. So I edit my listener's knowledge base and will add a service here. Instead of adding it from here, we will prefer the recommended way, doing it through the GUI. To my listener's knowledge, I will statically add the other database as well. The name of the other database is BSCS RPT. This is a quite old status. We must update the latest status. So my listener only knows as of now about national database. Then I go to local service naming. I already in my listener's knowledge, that is database services, I will add one more by saying add database button here, and then I say the name of the database is this one. I save it, come back to here, and then I use the same command again. So far my listener is not aware because my listener was started earlier and the configuration has been revised now. I must say lsnrctl reload. Now it will revise the configuration, it will pick up the second entry. Now I check status, my listener is aware now. Now I try doing the same thing that I failed on the earlier occasion, and that is to use this one. This time the connection happened because my listener is aware of that service. Now what happens when the listener itself is down? I say lsnrctl stop. The clients would receive an error message saying TNS no listener. Then I try to make the connection the way I have attempted it from my client machine, and I get an error message saying on the other side there is no listener there. You can check a ping request with the name of the host, whether the host is reachable on the network. Similar way on the Oracle side, you have a TNS ping request to find out what is remote DB taking me to. So remote DB is the TNS entry on the client side which connects to this host on this port. So this is a quick test to find out why someone is facing connection related issue. So you can do a TNS ping followed by the name of your TNS names.ora entry to find out where it actually takes you. And if you see here, there's an error. Let's start the listener on the server side, and then we try doing the same thing again, and it says okay, and this has happened in 0 milliseconds. So the listener has responded back saying I am alive on the other side. So on the client side we have seen SQLnet.ora file which has this variable names.directory_path which identifies what are the default options for names resolution. We said easy connect, host name, TNS names. So ideally TNS name should be the first one, and is very common that wherever you have Oracle client software installed, you will have that TNS names as the default one. But not to worry, even if you don't have one, you can always use this way of connection. This way of connection where you define host names, the port number and the database name to which you want to connect is called as easy connect. But let's see what happens when I disable easy connect as one of the options. So I go to profile on the client's machine, which apparently is not responding for some reason. Am I on the correct machine? No, I am on the client machine here. Now I remove from here the easy connect method. I save this configuration, will validate it. There's no more easy connect now. Now my client tries to connect in using the same method, it still works. So easy connect is anyways the default option list. whether it's explicitly mentioned or not mentioned. This is on the server side. That's pretty much you need to know about the Listener.ora and the role of TNS names in case of networking. So this is how your clients come to know about where to connect over a network. Thanks for joining in. I'm going to pause this video here.